It was a perfect morning when I decided to head out for a solo hike. The air was crisp, and the sun, just beginning to rise, cast soft light through the trees. I was craving solitude, no one to bother me, no distractions. The kind of peaceful quiet you can only find in nature, far away from the city. The trail I chose was one I'd been on before, a loop that takes you through dense woods and up a steep ridge with views stretching for miles. It wasn't a well-known spot, so I liked that. There would be fewer people, more room to breathe. I parked my car at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and set off. The trail started off easy, winding through a stand of pines. The scent of fresh pine needles filled the air, and the crunch of my boots on the dirt path was the only sound I could hear. The farther I walked, the more the sounds of the world seemed to fade. Soon, all that was left was the sound of my breathing and the occasional chirp of a bird. The first part of the hike was smooth, almost serene. The path was clearly marked, and the trees, tall and dense, provided a canopy that kept the sun from hitting the ground too harshly. The temperature was perfect, not too hot, not too cold. I could feel the sweat starting to form on the back of my neck, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just enough to remind me I was working my body. The trail slowly began to ascend, and I welcomed the challenge. Hiking uphill always felt more rewarding, and I liked the burn in my legs. It was one of those moments when everything felt right, like you were exactly where you were supposed to be. About an hour into the hike, I reached a clearing where I could catch my breath. The ridge was just ahead, but I needed a moment. I found a large rock to sit on, unpacked my water bottle, and took a long drink. As I sat there, I let my eyes wander across the landscape. The valley below was still wrapped in the early morning mist, and the distant hills seemed to float just above the fog. It was beautiful, silent, undisturbed, like a painting. I checked my watch. I had time. I wasn't in a rush. So I stood up, shouldered my pack, and continued on the trail, which was beginning to get steeper. The trail became a bit rougher as I climbed, with rocks jutting out and the earth beneath my feet soft from the recent rain. I slowed my pace, careful not to slip, and reached for the roots of trees to steady myself. It wasn't hard, but it required focus. As I made my way higher, the landscape started to change. The pines were replaced by smaller trees and thick underbrush. The air was cooler now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to grow quieter, the noise of the world below fading away. It was just me and the trail, and I liked it that way. I didn't notice at first, but the trail had started to narrow. The dirt path was now just a small strip between two thick walls of brush. My eyes darted around a bit more now, looking for anything unusual. I'd hiked this path before, but it felt different today. There was a heaviness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I paused for a moment, letting the thought pass. I wasn't going to let a weird feeling ruin my day. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. The quiet had a way of doing that to you, made you overly aware of every little sound, every snap of a twig. I took a deep breath, shook it off, and kept walking. The higher I climbed, the more the trail seemed to twist. The path became even steeper, and the trees more gnarled and twisted. I wasn't sure if it was the altitude or just the isolation, but everything felt off. It was the kind of feeling you get when something's out of place, but you can't put your finger on what exactly it is. I tried to focus on my footing. The last thing I needed was to trip or lose my balance. But something in the back of my mind kept pulling my attention elsewhere. I stopped again, this time scanning the surroundings. There was no one else here. I hadn't passed a single person since I started, which was unusual for this trail. It wasn't a busy spot, but there were usually a few others hiking, especially on weekends. I squinted at the trees, trying to make sense of the feeling creeping into my chest. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I checked my map, I was close to the summit now, just a short distance to go. I told myself to relax, enjoy the view when I got there. That's what I came for, after all, the feeling of being on top of the world. But as I pushed on, the strange sense of being watched only grew stronger. My steps seemed louder now, the sound of my boots on the dirt unnervingly obvious. I looked behind me once, just to make sure, but the trail was empty. It was just me, the trees, and the occasional rustling of leaves. Then something happened. It was subtle at first. A slight shift in the air, a coldness that wasn't there before. I felt it on the back of my neck, like a chill creeping under my skin. And in that moment, I heard something. A branch snapped, far off to my left. My heart skipped. I froze, ears straining for more sound. Nothing. The forest was still again. I told myself it was an animal. It had to be. I was in the wilderness, after all. Deer, maybe, or a bear. But something about the stillness that followed made my skin prickle. I looked around, but there was no sign of movement. The forest was dense, and the trail twisted out of sight quickly. But I could swear that the air felt different, heavier, as if something was closing in. I took a few more steps forward, trying to push the feeling out of my mind, but it wasn't working. It felt like the trees themselves were watching me, like the forest was alive in a way it hadn't been before. The silence seemed unnatural, oppressive. The wind, which had been gentle before, was now barely a whisper, like it was holding its breath too. And then I heard it again, a snap of a branch. This time it was closer, much closer. My heart raced. I looked around, but there was nothing. Just trees, thick brush, and the narrow trail in front of me. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I keep moving? Should I turn back? The thought of turning back felt wrong. I didn't want to go down the mountain alone, not now. But the uneasy feeling, the sense of something lurking, was growing stronger by the second. I took a few more cautious steps forward, glancing behind me every now and then. The sense of being watched wouldn't go away. It was as if the forest was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. The trail curved again, and I found myself at a small ledge overlooking a deep ravine. The drop was steep, and the forest below stretched out into the valley. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something about the way the trees crowded the edge of the ravine, as though they were concealing something, or someone. I stood there for a moment, just watching, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, but I couldn't find the reason for my unease. It was a simple hike, a beautiful day, but everything felt wrong. Then I heard it, a sound, clear, unmistakable. Footsteps, not far behind me. It was supposed to be just a regular hike. That was what I kept telling myself as I packed my gear the night before. Just another trail, just another day. But I should have known better. Something in the air, something in the silence of the night, felt off. The next morning, I set out early, a cool breeze brushing against my skin as the sun was still low on the horizon. I had picked the trail specifically for its solitude. Not many people hiked there, so I could count on the peace. I didn't expect it to be so eerily quiet, though. The birds were still asleep, and the forest didn't feel alive at all. I parked at the trailhead, grabbed my bag, and set off. The path started with some light climbing through sparse trees, the ground covered in fallen pine needles. The air smelled like damp earth, not unpleasant, just the kind of scent that told you the forest was waking up. As I walked, my boots crunched on the gravel and dirt, my breath steady. I've hiked plenty of times before, so the rhythm came easily. But it didn't take long for something to start bothering me. The silence was unnerving, the kind of silence that gnaws at the edges of your mind, makes your thoughts feel too loud. The forest was supposed to be alive with noise, rustling leaves, chirping birds, the distant call of wildlife. But there was none of that. The only sound was the crunching of my boots on the path. At one point, I stopped to drink from my water bottle, scanning the woods around me, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. Nothing moved. The trees stood like quiet sentinels, and even the wind had stopped. I thought about turning back then, but something kept me going. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe the hope that things would feel normal again soon. So I kept walking deeper into the woods. The first hour passed without incident. Then, as the trail began to wind uphill, I noticed something odd. There was a trail marker I hadn't seen before, one that seemed out of place. It was a faded wooden sign, barely visible through the underbrush, pointing off to the side. I hadn't seen it on the map, nor had any of the reviews mentioned it. Curiosity tugged at me. I was a little tired from the uphill climb, but it seemed harmless enough to check it out. The side path was narrow and barely visible, almost like it had been forgotten by time. I wondered if anyone had used it in years, but there was no going back now, so I pressed on. The path twisted and turned, the trees growing denser. The light filtering through the canopy began to thin as I moved further away from the main trail, and the air seemed cooler, damp even. It was like I was stepping into another world entirely. About 20 minutes into the side path, I noticed a small clearing up ahead, and I felt a strange sense of relief, as though I'd made it to a landmark. As I reached the clearing, I saw something that made my heart race. There was a small, abandoned campsite, a fire pit surrounded by scattered rocks. A few charred logs lay around it. But it wasn't the campsite itself that made me uneasy. It was the objects that had been left behind. Old food wrappers, an empty bottle of whiskey, a pair of hiking boots, the soles worn down to almost nothing. And in the center of it all, something that made my stomach drop. A torn, dirty sleeping bag, half tucked under a large rock. The fabric had clearly been used, but it wasn't the kind of use you'd expect from a regular camper. It looked strange, as though it had been left there in a hurry. I couldn't place why, but I had the strongest feeling I was not alone. My eyes darted around, but there was nothing. No signs of recent life, no footprints. The wind picked up suddenly, and the trees creaked, as if they were trying to warn me. I told myself it was just the wind, just my nerves. I took a deep breath and turned to leave, but before I could, something caught my eye. A small piece of paper, half hidden beneath a stone. It was folded tightly. I bent down to pick it up. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and it smelled faintly of mildew. I opened it carefully, hoping to find a clue as to who had been here. It was a map, but not of the area I was hiking in. The ink was faded, and there were strange marks all over it. Scratches, notations, and what looked like warning symbols drawn in a hurried, almost frantic manner. It seemed like someone had been trying to warn whoever would find it. I unfolded it completely, tracing my finger along the edges, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A red X marked a location, far off from the main trail, and written next to it were words that were difficult to make out. But one part was legible: "Don't go past here." My heart pounded in my chest. I stood there for a moment, frozen, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The chill that had settled in my bones deepened, and I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back and leave the way I came. But something about the note, something about the urgency it conveyed, made me want to push forward. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, perhaps some kind of answer or maybe just closure. But I had already come this far, and the red X on the map seemed like it might lead to something important, something I couldn't ignore. I folded the note carefully and stuffed it into my backpack. I retraced my steps, heading back toward the main trail, my mind racing. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt heavier now, the sounds of the forest strangely muted. I couldn't hear any birds or rustling leaves. My footsteps sounded too loud. The moment I stepped back onto the main trail, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate just off to my left. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. There was no one there when I turned, just shadows beneath the trees. But I could feel eyes on me, like I was being watched. My pace quickened as I hurried down the path, my breath growing shallow. Every part of me screamed to get out of the forest, to return to the safety of the car. But just as I reached the point where the trail split, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. At the intersection of the trail, there was a figure, a man standing perfectly still, facing away from me. He was dressed in hiking gear, much like mine, but his presence felt off. There was something unnatural about him. He didn't seem to be moving, and yet, I knew he was watching me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call out, ask if he needed help, but a voice in the back of my mind told me not to. I turned to the side path to avoid him, my heart hammering in my chest. But just as I did, I heard a rustling sound behind me. The man was following me. I picked up my pace, my feet stumbling on the uneven path. I could hear his footsteps behind me, always just a little too close. I reached the next turn, nearly tripping over a rock, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The sense of urgency, of danger, pushed me forward, each step feeling like it might be my last. Finally, I saw the trailhead in the distance, the parking lot beyond it. My car was still there, still parked in the same spot. I burst out of the trees and onto the gravel road. I didn't look back. I didn't care who or what was behind me. I reached my car, heart racing, and slammed the door shut. I sat there, hands trembling on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I been imagining things? I kept thinking about the man, about the strange map, about the warning. But in that moment, as the engine roared to life and I sped away, I realized one thing. I'd made it out. I was safe. And whatever was out there, whatever had been watching me, was still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too far from the main path. The sun had just started to dip behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. I had been hiking alone for the past 3 hours, steadily making my way through the dense forest that lined the base of the hills. It was the kind of afternoon where the air is cool, crisp, and filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. I had done this hike many times before, but today something felt off. I had set out early in the morning, eager to conquer a trail I had heard about but never ventured on myself. The path was supposed to be challenging, with steep inclines and rocky passages, but that didn't bother me. I was used to hiking alone. Being out in nature was when I felt most at peace. The rhythmic sound of my boots hitting the dirt, the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees, and the soft chirps of birds in the distance. It all put me in a place of calm. But today was different. I couldn't put my finger on it. The woods felt denser, darker somehow. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was never anyone there, just the trees and the rocks. I stopped for a moment to take a swig from my water bottle, wiping my brow with the back of my hand. Sweat dripped down my neck, the cool breeze offering a little relief from the effort of the climb. I glanced up at the sky. The clouds had started to roll in, thick and gray, blotting out the sun entirely. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant, and a sense of unease settled over me. Pushing forward, I continued along the trail, which now narrowed into a single path between thick underbrush. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots was louder now, and the wind was no longer gentle. It howled through the trees like a warning. It was strange, considering I hadn't seen a single sign of wildlife in hours. No squirrels, no birds, not even the occasional rustle of a deer in the distance. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something odd. A piece of fabric, A torn, faded red cloth was caught on a branch. At first, I thought it was just trash, but as I drew closer, I noticed it didn't seem right. It looked like it had been there for a while. The cloth was frayed at the edges, like it had been torn from something, and there was dirt and moss clinging to it as if it had been caught in the branches for days. I reached out and gently tugged at it, but it didn't come loose easily. Something about it made me hesitate. My fingers brushed against the rough texture of the fabric, and I couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl up my spine. I let go of it and stepped back, my eyes scanning the trees around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like someone or something was watching me. I shrugged it off as my imagination getting the better of me. After all, this was just a trail in the woods. People must hike it all the time, right? I continued on, but the atmosphere felt heavier now. The silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. The wind had died down completely, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. It felt like the world had gone still, as though the very forest was holding its breath. The trail seemed to go on forever, winding through the trees, the path becoming steeper and rockier. My legs ached with each step, but I pressed on, eager to reach the summit. My goal was simple: to see the view from the top and feel that rush of accomplishment. I needed that release, but the further I went, the more I started to feel disoriented. The path didn't look familiar anymore. I had hiked this trail before, yet the trees seemed to change around me, becoming more twisted, more gnarled. The light was fading quickly, and I knew I needed to make a decision: turn back or push on. I checked my watch. It was almost 6 p.m. I hadn't planned on being out this late, but I felt stubborn. I was so close to the summit, just a little further. As I kept climbing, my sense of direction started to slip. I had always been good at navigating, but now it was as though the trail was playing tricks on me. The trees looked different, the rocks seemed unfamiliar. I reached for my map, but when I pulled it out, I found that I couldn't make sense of it. The markings on it didn't align with what I saw in front of me. The path that should have been straight ahead twisted off to the side, leading into an area I knew I hadn't passed through before. Panic began to creep in, but I refused to let it take over. I had hiked in the woods many times. I knew how to get out. I just needed to calm down and think clearly. I stopped for a moment, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths. My heart was pounding now, and the air felt colder. I was alone, and for the first time, I started to feel the weight of that isolation. The kind of isolation that sinks into your bones, making everything seem more sinister than it really is. I took another look at the map, trying to figure out where I was. That's when I heard it, the snap of a twig in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I glanced around, scanning the trees, but there was no movement, just the wind whispering through the branches. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Someone was out there, watching me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel, but the feeling didn't go away. I was being watched. I had to get moving. Turning back, I retraced my steps, hoping to find the trail I'd missed. But the woods now seemed to close in on me, as though the trees were pressing closer, their twisted limbs reaching out to grab me. Every step I took felt heavier, the ground beneath my boots uneven and treacherous. The shadows were long now, and the fading light made everything look distorted, like I was walking through a dream. Then I saw it. Up ahead, barely visible through the underbrush, was a small clearing. It wasn't part of the trail. It was too open, too unnervingly quiet. And in the center of the clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of boots. They were still just sitting there in the middle of the clearing, as if abandoned. They weren't facing me, and there was no sign of the person who had been wearing them. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Who else could be out here? The only other person I'd seen on the trail was a hiker hours ago. But that was it. I hadn't passed anyone since. I slowly took a few steps toward the clearing, my body tense. I didn't want to get any closer, but I couldn't look away from those boots. I had to know. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave their boots here, alone in the woods? As I got closer, I saw something else. Something that made my stomach churn. A piece of clothing caught on a branch. It was the same red cloth I had seen earlier, but it wasn't just fabric. It was torn, jagged, like someone had been pulled through the bushes in a hurry. My mind raced, the hairs on my neck prickled, and I took a step back, suddenly desperate to get out of there. Then I heard something, a sound in the distance, a low guttural growl. I froze. This wasn't an animal. It was something else, something human. The sound came again, closer this time, and my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a growl at all. It was the sound of someone struggling, gasping for breath. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My legs pumped furiously, the sound of my breath in my ears drowning out everything else. I had to get off this trail. I had to get back to the parking lot where I knew I'd be safe. I didn't stop running until I reached the familiar markers of the trailhead, the sounds of the forest growing distant behind me. When I finally emerged from the woods, gasping for air and drenched in sweat, I was met with the sight of my car parked in the lot. I didn't hesitate for a second. I jumped into the driver's seat and sped off without a second glance at the woods. The night felt heavy on my shoulders, but I was safe, for now. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the image of those abandoned boots in the clearing. Something had happened out there, and whatever it was far from over. The sun had just begun to dip behind the distant hills as I set out on my hike. I'd been planning this for weeks, picking the perfect trail. It wasn't too popular, but it wasn't entirely isolated either. Just the kind of place to lose yourself in nature without running into a crowd. The morning had been bright, the air fresh, but now, as I strapped my pack tighter and adjusted my boots, a slight chill had settled over the landscape. I glanced around at the woods that seemed so welcoming. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in a layer of damp fallen leaves. I liked that feeling, the quiet rustling of the forest, the fresh smell of earth, and the sound of distant birds. It all felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of daily life. With a deep breath, I began walking. The first hour went by without incident, and I found myself enjoying the solitude. The trees on either side of the path were thick with moss, their trunks gnarled and twisted, like they had stories to tell. I found myself distracted by the forest's beauty, how the sunlight filtered through the canopy in soft rays, making the leaves shimmer. I had forgotten how calming it was to be out here, away from the noise of the city. But then something happened. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. I stopped, leaning closer to examine it. It wasn't much, just a small scrap of dark green material. It looked old, the edges frayed as if it had been there for a while. I pulled my pack a little tighter, suddenly aware of the creeping sensation down my spine. There was nothing to suggest anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone else had been through here recently. I shrugged it off. I was overthinking it. The trail had seen plenty of hikers, and it wasn't as if I was alone. There were other people who had hiked it before me, right? But the further I walked, the less sure I felt. The trail seemed to grow quieter, as though the forest itself had gone still. The wind stopped, the birds stopped chirping. All I could hear now was the crunch of my boots against the ground. It had only been a couple of hours, but the daylight was fading faster than I expected. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the twilight, leaving the path dim and shadowed. I checked my watch. Maybe I should turn back, but the thought of retracing my steps didn't sit well with me. I come this far and I wasn't going to cut it short. The trail began to narrow further, the trees pressing in on both sides. I could see where the path had been washed out in places, with thick roots emerging from the earth like veins in the ground. I tried to step lightly, careful not to trip. The quiet was unsettling now, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint squeak of distant branches. Just as I was about to dismiss the eerie sensation creeping up on me, I saw something ahead. It was a small clearing, just big enough to allow a view of the horizon through the trees. I walked into it cautiously, drawn by the strange pull of the open space. The ground here was covered in soft moss, and the air felt slightly warmer, as though the sun still clung to this spot despite the setting of the day. And then I saw it. A small wooden cabin stood in the distance, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and vines. It was so out of place. No other structures had been mentioned on the map, and I certainly hadn't read about any cabins in the area. I didn't even know if it was abandoned or still in use, but there it was, old and worn, with peeling paint and windows that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. I felt an involuntary shiver crawl up my spine. My first instinct was to turn around, to head back the way I came. Something about that cabin felt wrong, but curiosity won out. Maybe it was just my imagination. I walked closer, every step slow, deliberate, as if I were about to disturb something sacred. The closer I got, the more I noticed details I hadn't seen at first. There were small hand-carved symbols etched into the wood, faint and faded by time, as though they'd been scratched into the surface long ago. A sudden breeze blew through the trees, and I thought I heard something, a whisper. But when I stopped to listen, all I heard was the rustling of leaves. I reached the cabin and peered through one of the dirty windows. The inside was dark, the light barely enough to reveal shadows. It looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. Furniture covered in dust, and what appeared to be a stack of old newspapers lying in a corner. I considered going inside. Maybe I'd find something interesting, maybe just a strange relic of someone's past. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. I stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin, unsure of what to do next. The sinking sun cast long shadows across the ground, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. I looked around, and for the first time I realized how quiet the world had become. The forest was holding its breath. A crackling noise broke the silence, sharp and sudden. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. It was only the wind moving a branch, or perhaps some small animal scurrying in the underbrush. But in that moment, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into my chest. I decided it was time to go. The last thing I wanted was to be caught in the dark in a place that felt so off. I made my way back along the trail, keeping my pace steady. But as I walked, I couldn't help but feel as though I was being followed. Not by a person, but by something far less tangible. The air seemed heavier now, oppressive even. I quickened my pace, my footsteps becoming louder in the quiet of the forest. The feeling of being watched never left me. The trees seemed closer, the shadows deeper. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. When I finally reached the point where the trail forked, I let out a sigh of relief. The main path was just ahead, and I was close enough to the end that I could see the distant clearing where I had started earlier. The sun was nearly gone now, but there was enough light left to guide me. But then, as I stepped toward the familiar path, something made me stop. Something wasn't right. I looked around, my eyes darting over the trees, and that's when I saw it. The cabin. It was no longer in the distance. It was there right in front of me, just off the trail, hidden by trees. How had it moved? How could it be there now? I stood frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical part of me screamed that it couldn't be real. But the cabin was there, unmistakable in its decrepitude. I could see the faded paint and the carved symbols once again. And the feeling of being watched? It was stronger now. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't move. I stared at the cabin as if it were some sort of puzzle that needed solving, but it only deepened my sense of dread. And then it hit me. I was lost, completely and utterly lost. The trail I had been following was no longer there. The trees had closed in around me in ways they hadn't before, and the path I had walked on so confidently was gone. I had no idea how I had ended up back here at the cabin. My throat tightened, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. My phone had no signal, and I had no way to call for help. The weight of the situation hit me all at once. I had to think clearly. Slowly, I turned around. My only choice was to go back the way I had come. I walked away from the cabin, trying to steady my breathing, but I didn't look back again. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the point where the trail forked again. This time, there was no cabin. There was no lingering presence, no whispers in the trees, just the familiar path that led me back to the clearing. I was shaken but relieved. I had made it out. The hike was over, and I could see the distant parking lot where my car was parked. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, that something in the forest had changed me. I may have been alone, but I knew I would never feel alone again. The woods had a way of creeping into your soul, even when you didn't see it coming. The trail may have been over, but the sense of unease lingered long after I left the forest behind. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. The woods had a way of getting into your mind, and once it did, it never truly let go. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains as I began my hike. I had been planning this for weeks, wanting to escape the city for a few days and find some peace in the wilderness. Just me, the forest, and the fresh air. It was supposed to be an easy trail, nothing too demanding. I had read up on it, checked all the maps, and packed light. The weather was supposed to be clear, the trail manageable, and the whole experience just a relaxing getaway. I didn't know then how quickly it would go from peaceful to something else entirely. The path was well maintained, wide enough to make the journey comfortable. The trees around me were tall, thick, their branches casting long shadows as the sun sank lower. Birds flitted in and out of sight, the occasional rustling of leaves making me feel like I was in a living, breathing world, far from the noise and stress of everyday life. I moved with an easy pace, taking in the sights, the soft crunch of my boots on the gravel path, the sound of distant water trickling somewhere far below, and the scent of pine and earth. I felt alive in a way that only nature could make me feel, but there was something in the air that I couldn't shake. A quiet unease, like a thin thread of tension weaving through the calm. Maybe it was just my imagination, nothing more than the wind or the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But there were moments when the rustling stopped suddenly, when the forest seemed to go completely still, as though it was holding its breath. As the trail narrowed and the trees thickened, I noticed the trail markers were becoming more spaced out. It was subtle at first, but then it became impossible to ignore. The trees were beginning to look more alike, each one an identical sentinel, tall and looming, their trunks rough and knotted. And the further I went, the harder it was to tell where I was. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But it was hard not to notice how the shadows were stretching longer, how the air had grown cooler. The sun was almost gone now, only a faint light clinging to the horizon. My phone had no signal out here, so I couldn't rely on it for navigation. I looked around, trying to find the next marker, but I couldn't spot anything. My heart began to beat a little faster. I stopped for a moment, trying to regain my composure. I had read that getting lost on this trail wasn't unheard of. People had made it out just fine, so I wasn't too worried. I turned around, expecting to see the familiar markers of the trail I had just walked, but the path behind me looked different. It wasn't just the angle or the shadows. There was something distinctly wrong about it. The trees seemed to have shifted, blocking my view of the trail I had just come from. I couldn't even remember which direction I had taken. A few moments passed before I realized how much I was starting to panic. I tried to calm myself down, taking deep breaths. I had hiked alone before. I'd always been careful to stay on the path. There was no need to freak out, but my mind wasn't cooperating. I felt trapped in the woods, surrounded by these towering trees that didn't seem to know where I was supposed to go. I retraced my steps as best I could, but the more I looked, the more the trail seemed to have disappeared. The underbrush was thicker now, the ground uneven. Every step felt like it was pulling me further away from the world I knew. I should have turned back earlier. The light was almost gone when I finally gave in to the fact that I was lost. I tried to find the trail again, scanning for any sign, but nothing stood out. I hadn't seen another soul since I started, and now I was alone in a place that was starting to feel hostile. The weight of the silence pressed in on me. The sky was getting darker, and the forest felt deeper and more foreign by the minute. I had no choice but to find shelter. I couldn't risk walking in the dark, and I wasn't about to spend the night on the forest floor with nothing but my jacket and a backpack full of snacks. My mind raced, trying to think of the best course of action. I thought about turning back again, but I wasn't sure where the trail was anymore. So I picked a direction, any direction, and walked. The woods felt different now. The trees weren't just tall and silent anymore. They were oppressive, looming over me like silent watchers. The wind had picked up, whipping through the leaves in a way that sounded unnatural, almost as though it was trying to get my attention. The rustling wasn't just the wind anymore. It was more like something moving through the trees, shifting just out of sight. I glanced around quickly, but saw nothing. Still, the sense that I wasn't alone gnawed at me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone there, but there was no one. The forest had grown colder, and my breath was visible in the dimming light. My pace quickened, my boots crunching against the frozen earth now. I could feel the panic creeping back into my chest, and I tried to force it down. It was irrational. I was just in the woods, a bit off track, but I could find my way. Still, my mind wasn't hearing any of it. I had to get out of there. The trail markers were gone, but something else appeared. It was subtle, something that could have been easily overlooked if I wasn't looking so desperately for any sign of direction. There was a faint indentation in the earth, a path that hadn't been there before, just off to the side. Without much thought, I followed it, moving as quickly as I dared. The ground grew softer, the trees thinning out, and I began to feel that maybe I was on the right path after all. And then, as if in answer to my silent pleas, I saw the first glimpse of light. It wasn't much at first. A small break in the canopy above, just enough for the last sliver of the sun to break through and light up the dirt trail ahead. The forest felt a little less dense now, the air fresher. My pace slowed, the anxiety in my chest loosening with every step. I followed the new path, each step seeming more confident than the last, until I finally reached the clearing. I stumbled out of the woods and into a wide, open space. There, just ahead, was a cabin. It was small, weathered but sturdy looking, nestled at the edge of a steep hill. There was a faint light glowing from the window, a warm, inviting sight in the growing dark. I was shaken, exhausted, but the sense of relief flooded through me. I didn't care how far I had wandered, or how lost I had been. I had found my way back. I made my way toward the cabin, knocking hesitantly on the door. An older man answered, his face full of surprise but softened by a kindness that made me feel welcome. He must have seen the panic in my eyes, because without hesitation, he let me inside, offering me hot tea and a place to rest. It turned out this cabin had been his for years, tucked away from the main trail, only accessible by small, forgotten paths like the one I had stumbled upon. He spoke about the woods like a familiar friend, one that had seen many travelers like me get turned around. He offered some advice on how to better navigate the trails for next time, and after a long night of rest, I left the cabin at dawn, following the trail markers carefully and steadily until I finally emerged back onto the main path. It wasn't the peaceful getaway I had planned, but it was a reminder that sometimes the wilderness, with all its beauty and serenity, could turn on you in the blink of an eye. I left that mountain with a new respect for its power and the quiet wisdom that comes from knowing just how easy it is to lose yourself, and just how important it is to find your way back. The air had a strange, still quality as I stepped off the gravel trail and into the dense woods. It was late autumn, the trees bare and hunched like forgotten statues. The air smelled earthy, wet, like the ground was soaking in everything it could before winter arrived. I had been on a lot of hikes, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't that I was unprepared. I had my gear, a map, and a compass, but the isolation of the forest had a way of making me feel small, insignificant, like I didn't quite belong here. The trail I was following was a small, unmarked path that branched off from a well-trodden route near the outskirts of the park. The idea of exploring something untouched, something that few people ever bothered to see, was part of the draw for me. I liked the quiet, the challenge of being out in nature alone. But as the sun started to dip lower, the forest seemed to close in on me, and the easy rhythm of my footsteps became harder to keep. I checked my phone. No signal. It wasn't unusual, but it made me feel just a little more vulnerable. That feeling of being disconnected from the world outside was like a weight on my chest. I pushed it aside, focusing on my pace. The path ahead was narrowing, becoming less defined as I pushed deeper into the woods. The ground underfoot was soft and slick with fallen leaves. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no bird song, no rustling in the trees, only the faint sound of wind brushing through the branches high above me. The deeper I walked, the less I felt connected to the world I knew. It was as if the forest was slowly swallowing me whole, and the trail, which had been so clear at the beginning, was now barely a suggestion of a path. Hours passed, and the sunlight began to fade, leaving only a dim twilight filtering through the canopy. I pulled out my flashlight from my backpack and clicked it on. Its beam cut through the gloom, revealing the trunks of gnarled trees, their branches twisted into strange shapes, like ancient hands reaching toward the sky. I hadn't intended to hike this long. The plan had been a short afternoon hike, a few miles at most, and then back to the car before dark. But the longer I walked, the more the forest seemed to keep me there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into its heart. Something about it was off, like the land was telling me I didn't belong. I paused to check my map, but it didn't help. The unmarked path wasn't on it. I had made a wrong turn somewhere, but I couldn't tell where. Panic started to bubble in my chest. I was too far in to turn back now, and besides, the thought of retracing my steps into the unknown felt worse than just continuing forward. The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and I shivered despite myself. The woods, which had felt peaceful at first, now felt cold, oppressive. The kind of cold that didn't just chill your skin, but seeped into your bones. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept walking, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at my gut. I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. There was something in the distance, a shadow. At first, I thought it was just the way the light was playing through the trees, but then I saw it again, moving. I squinted into the darkness. It was too large to be an animal and too oddly shaped to be a person. The more I stared, the more it seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I wasn't sure if it was real or if I was imagining it. I told myself it was probably just my nerves, After all, I had been out here for hours, and the isolation was starting to get to me. But then it happened again, closer this time. I didn't wait to see if it would appear once more. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The forest closed in around me. The trail was now a vague outline beneath my feet, and I had no sense of direction anymore. The flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted, trying to find something, anything, that would tell me I was still on the right path. My breath came in shallow bursts, the panic seizing my chest. I couldn't tell if I was hearing footsteps behind me or if it was just my own heart pounding in my ears. My legs felt heavy, my mind racing through thoughts of how I had gotten here. I was getting lost, I knew that much, but I couldn't stop, not now. And then it happened. My foot caught on a root and I went crashing to the ground. The air rushed out of my lungs as I landed hard on the dirt, scraping my palms. For a moment, all I could hear was the ringing silence in my ears and the rapid beating of my heart. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what was happening. My flashlight had rolled a few feet away, its beam still flickering across the forest floor, casting strange shadows on the trees. I looked around, but all I could see was the dark and the eerie stillness. Then I heard it, a rustling, not the usual whine through the trees, but something else, movement, deliberate. I wasn't alone. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then there was a sound, a low, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was something else, something wrong. My mind raced as I scanned the trees, desperate for any sign of a way out. But there was nothing, only shadows and the oppressive dark. I had no choice but to keep moving, to push myself forward, to trust my instincts. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Don't panic, I told myself. Just find the trail, find the way back. And then, as if the forest itself decided to give me a break, I saw something up ahead, light. Faint glow, distant but real. I squinted, trying to focus, and realized it was the moon, rising above the trees. The path ahead was clearer now, the light giving me just enough to see. I pushed myself toward it, running again, my legs burning with exhaustion. It felt like an eternity before I finally stumbled onto a wider trail. A real trail, a familiar one. I didn't hesitate. I ran harder, faster, until I emerged from the woods, gasping for air. I was back on the main trail, the one that led to the parking lot. The darkness still hung heavy in the air, but now I was able to see it for what it was. Just night. The trees were no longer looming, and the eerie feelings slowly dissipated as I walked toward the clearing. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was shaking uncontrollably, but I was safe. I stood by my car for a few moments, just breathing, trying to calm my racing heart. It had been stupid, I knew that. I had been reckless, venturing into an unknown path, letting my curiosity lead me too far. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine, the familiar hum of the car's motor grounding me back to reality. But as I pulled out of the lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the woods. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd really escaped it at all. I've always loved hiking. It's a simple thing, really, just walking in nature, listening to the sounds of the wind through the trees and the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath your boots. I've hiked in many places before, across well-known trails, up through mountains, and into quiet forests. But this time was different. This time I had chosen a trail I didn't know much about. And looking back, I wonder if I should have stayed home. I'd come across a flyer for the trail at a small outdoor shop in the last town before the wilderness began. It wasn't particularly popular, the trail that is. Most people didn't talk about it, not even the locals. That should have been a red flag, but I was too eager to get away from everything. I was worn out from work, from the noise of the city, and just needed something to clear my head. The idea of being alone in the woods, far from anyone, felt right. The flyer said it was a 2-day trek, easy to moderate difficulty, and had some decent views of nearby cliffs and valleys. Promised quiet solitude, which sounded like exactly what I needed. The map on the back looked straightforward enough, just a path that twisted through the trees, up over some hills, and down into a quiet hollow near a creek. Couldn't resist. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a couple of days worth of food, water, and some first aid supplies. The usual stuff. It was about mid-morning when I hit the trailhead. The sun was still high in the sky, and the air was cool with a slight breeze, just enough to remind me that autumn was coming. The first few hours were peaceful. The trail was easy to follow, winding through thick woods with the occasional clearing that let in beams of sunlight. Birds chirped in the trees, and every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of a squirrel darting from one tree to the next. I kept walking, taking in the quiet around me. My mind cleared with each step. But by late afternoon, something started to feel off. It wasn't the kind of off that made me panic. It was subtler. The sounds of the forest seemed to change. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind through the trees sounded heavier, like it was struggling to move through something dense. I paused and looked around, but I couldn't see anything out of place. Nothing was wrong, not exactly, but I could sense the shift in the atmosphere. I shook it off. It wasn't the first time I'd felt uneasy in the woods. Sometimes it was just the isolation playing tricks on the mind. The trail began to narrow as the trees grew thicker, their branches reaching over the path like skeletal arms. It felt darker, though the sun hadn't dipped below the horizon yet. The air grew colder, and the quiet seemed to deepen, wrapping around me like a thick blanket. I hadn't passed another soul since I started. Around an hour before sunset, I reached a fork in the trail. The map didn't give much of an indication of which way was which, but it seemed like either path would lead me to the campsite. I took the right-hand path, the one that veered downhill, as it seemed the most direct. I was starting to feel the weight of the day's hike in my legs, and my stomach was reminding me that it was time to set up camp soon. The trail seemed to stretch longer than it should have, and as the sun began to sink lower, I started to pick up the pace. I had to get to that campsite before dark, or I'd be in trouble. It was getting darker by the minute, and my footsteps grew louder as I moved faster. The trees around me were becoming so dense that they blocked out much of the remaining light, leaving the forest floor covered in shadows. A strange feeling crept up my spine. I should have been near the campsite by now. I pulled out my map and checked it again, but the path on it didn't seem to match what I was seeing around me. I stopped in my tracks. The feeling of unease intensified, and I felt a cold knot of dread settle in my stomach. The trees were too close now, the underbrush too thick. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I tried to push the feeling away and told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I needed to focus. I needed to find the campsite. But the more I looked around, the more I realized that I hadn't seen a single trail marker since I turned onto this path. There were no signs of other hikers, no boot prints, no signs of worn soil. Just the sharp, unnerving quiet of the forest. I turned in circles, trying to spot something familiar, but nothing looked right. I pulled out my phone. There was no signal, of course. I wasn't expecting any, but it was a small comfort to know I could at least take a photo or call for help if needed. That's when I noticed something strange. My phone's battery was draining faster than it should have been, even though I hadn't been using it. Panic started to creep in. I shoved the phone back into my bag and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The sun was almost gone, and I needed to make a decision. I could either keep pressing on, hoping the campsite was just around the corner, or I could turn back and find the fork in the trail. The thought of retracing my steps didn't appeal to me, but I knew it was my best option. I turned around and began walking back the way I had come, trying to keep my pace steady. The air had grown colder, and a heavy fog began to rise from the forest floor, obscuring my view. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the distance, shadows darting behind trees, but when I stopped to look, nothing was there. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my mind growing more and more disoriented. The fog had thickened, and the trail seemed to stretch on endlessly. I stopped to rest for a moment, kneeling on a large rock. My breath was coming in quick gasps now, my heart racing. I needed to get out of here. I needed to find my way back to the trailhead, but I had no idea which way to go. That's when I heard it, a rustling. It wasn't far off, and it was too rhythmic to be the wind or an animal. Someone or something was moving through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, listening. The rustling stopped, but then I heard something else. A soft, almost inaudible sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I stood up, my legs trembling, and began to move, as quietly as I could, off the trail and into the underbrush. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, to run, but I didn't know which direction to go. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Whoever or whatever it was getting closer. I didn't dare look back. I just kept moving through the thick forest, my thoughts racing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel someone, following me. I don't know how long I walked like that, my mind foggy with fear, but eventually, I came upon a small clearing. In the distance, I saw a faint light. I moved toward it as quickly as I could. It wasn't much, just a faint glow, but it was enough to pull me forward. As I got closer, I realized it was the campsite I had been searching for earlier. A small fire burned in the center, its light flickering in the dark. I stumbled into the clearing, my breath ragged. The feeling of being followed had faded, but I still couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. But when I saw the campsite, I knew I was safe. I had made it. The campsite was untouched, and there was no sign of anyone else. I set up my tent quickly, hands shaking as I worked. Once inside, I zipped the flap closed and sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the night. The forest had quieted down again, and the tension in my body slowly began to ease. The next morning, I packed up quickly and hiked out of there as fast as I could. The fog had lifted, and the sun had come back out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, not because I didn't believe it, but because I wasn't sure if anyone would understand. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car waiting for me, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had made it. I'd escaped whatever it was in those woods. But I still wonder, every time I go hiking now, what would have happened if I had gone a little farther down that path or stayed just a little longer in the clearing. Maybe some things are better left unexplored. The morning was cool, and the sky was a dull gray as I laced up my hiking boots, ready for the trail. I had been planning this trip for weeks, eager to escape the routine of daily life and lose myself in nature for a day. The mountains weren't too far away from my small town, and I'd hiked in these woods before, though never on the more challenging paths. This time, I was setting out alone, drawn to the idea of solitude. I had checked the weather report the night before. It seemed perfect. No storms, no heat wave, just a quiet day for a walk in the woods. My pack was light, just some water, snacks, and a few extra layers in case the weather changed. I made sure I had a fully charged phone, though I didn't expect to need it. It was only a few hours hike after all. I locked the car and began walking toward the trailhead. The path started off easy enough, just a well-trodden dirt trail lined with pine trees. I could hear the crunch of the earth under my boots, the distant call of birds, and the faint rustling of the wind in the branches. The smell of damp earth filled the air, mixing with the fresh scent of pine needles. There was something calming about it, something familiar. I thought it would be a simple, quiet day, but I should have known better. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trail began to narrow. The trees around me grew thicker, the underbrush more dense. I passed a few small streams and stepped over a few fallen logs. I noticed how much the area had changed since my last visit. The trees were older now, their trunks thick with age, and some had fallen, rotting quietly in the damp soil. The sound of birds had diminished, and the air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off at first. Sometimes it's just quiet out here. The trail wound through a narrow ravine, and I could hear the distant murmur of a creek far below. The sun had started to fade behind the thick canopy, casting everything in a strange, dim light. It was almost as if the forest was slowly swallowing the warmth of the day. I kept walking, unaware that the trail had begun to diverge. I hadn't seen a marker for a while, but I assumed the path would eventually loop back. My watch told me I had been walking for about an hour, so I wasn't far from the halfway point. Still, the feeling in the air was changing. The forest had turned unusually quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. And then I noticed the first sign. At first, it was just a glimpse, something unusual on the path, almost out of place. I stopped in my tracks. A small object, half buried in the dirt, looked like a backpack strap. Curious, I knelt down to get a better look. The strap was frayed, its color faded by time. It seemed like an old piece of equipment, but I couldn't imagine why it would be here, far from the main trail. I pulled it out of the ground, and the dirt shifted around it. It was a hiking bag, but it was half buried, like it had been left here hastily, without any thought. No one had been here for a while. I glanced around, a small knot of unease forming in my stomach. There was no sign of anyone, no other footprints in the dirt, no signs of recent activity. I felt an odd chill, even though the air was still warm. I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe someone had just left their gear behind or gotten lost. I left the bag where it was, still feeling uneasy but not wanting to jump to conclusions. It wasn't my problem. The trail called me onward, so I kept walking. As the hours passed, the forest grew denser. The trees were so thick now that only slivers of light managed to peek through the gaps in the canopy. The trail had become a series of twisting switchbacks, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unsure of whether I was going the right way. My GPS was acting up, the signal weak. The once familiar sound of nature seemed muted, and I started to feel the creeping sense that I was no longer alone. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the air seemed to press in around me, how the trees appeared to bend inward, forming walls that made the forest feel more like a maze. The feeling wasn't something I could explain, but it gnawed at me. I quickened my pace, trying to shake it off, but every step felt heavier. Like the ground itself was pulling me down. I stopped at a clearing to take a breather and drank some water, trying to steady my nerves. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, and the light was fading quickly. I didn't want to be out here after dark, so I figured I'd start heading back soon. But just as I started to stand up, I heard something. At first, it was faint, a twig snapping in the distance. It was impossible to tell where it came from, but I was certain I wasn't alone. I strained my ears, listening for more sounds, but the forest was still, as if it had swallowed the noise completely. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something harmless, but the unsettling sensation didn't fade. Instead, it grew stronger. I packed up my things, deciding it was time to head back, but the trail had changed again. What had once been a clearly defined path now felt overgrown and uncertain. The faint trail markers I had been following were gone, and I found myself walking in circles. The sunlight was almost gone, and my phone had no service, no map to guide me. Panic started to rise in my chest. For hours I walked, hoping I would stumble across something familiar, but the forest stretched on, endless and silent. My feet ached, my throat was dry, and the creeping anxiety turned into something more real, genuine fear. I had lost my way. The thought sank in, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the thought of being lost. It was the overwhelming feeling that something was watching me. Every crack of a branch, every shift of the wind through the trees made my heart race. My breath was shallow, and my eyes darted constantly around me. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was out there. Hours passed. The sky darkened. I had no idea what time it was anymore. My headlamp provided little comfort against the overwhelming darkness. I didn't know where I was anymore, and I didn't know how to get back. It was at that point that I heard the sound again, the faint snap of twigs underfoot. I froze. This time, it wasn't the wind or the rustle of animals. It was too deliberate, too human. Someone else was out there, moving through the dark, but I couldn't see them. I tried to call out, but my voice sounded thin and weak in the vast emptiness of the woods. The snap of branches grew louder, closer. My heart hammered in my chest, and I gripped the edge of my backpack, trying to steady myself. I had to make a decision. Should I keep moving or wait for whatever was out there to show itself? With no better options, I decided to move. Every step felt like a challenge. The weight of the fear in my chest made my legs heavy, but I pressed on, determined to find my way out. Then, just as I thought I might break down, the path before me opened into a small, familiar clearing. And there it was, the trailhead. Couldn't believe it. I wasn't lost anymore. The parking lot was just a few hundred yards ahead. My car was in sight. The trail had led me in a circle, but somehow I had made it back. My legs were shaking. My heart was still racing, but I was out of the woods. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept walking toward the car, eager to be away from the oppressive quiet of the forest. Once I was safely inside, I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I was shaken, but I had made it out. I drove home in silence, my mind racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened. The odd feeling in the forest, the strange sense of being watched, the backpack I had found. It all still bothered me, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Sometimes, fear is a product of our own mind. The forest was just a forest, and I was just a hiker who had lost my way. The next day, I returned to the trailhead, hoping to shake the unease that still lingered. I wanted to be sure there was nothing strange out there. But when I arrived, I found something unexpected. The trail was as quiet as I had remembered it, and there was no sign of the backpack or anything unusual. I let out a long, steady breath and walked down the path once more, this time with the knowledge that fear can make everything feel more dangerous than it really is. And though the woods would always hold a certain mystery, I was no longer afraid of them. I was just a person walking through nature, and in the end, that was enough. I had been hiking solo for a while now, just me, my backpack, and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt trail. It was the kind of hike I had done countless times before, a routine I had gotten used to, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the weather, heavier than usual, the clouds hanging low in the sky, casting shadows that seemed to follow me. Or maybe it was just the kind of day when my instincts started kicking in, telling me to pay attention. The trail wasn't difficult. A few miles into the woods, it opened up into an old, overgrown path, one I had only taken once or twice before. The trees around me had grown tall and thick, their trunks knotted with vines and moss, their branches so heavy with leaves they almost seemed to block out the sun entirely. The air smelled of earth, damp from a recent rain, and the wind rustled the leaves softly, but not much more. It was quiet, too quiet. I checked my watch. The time read just past 3 p.m. Plenty of daylight left, but the clouds were closing in fast, and I could feel the temperature starting to drop. I had already decided to push through the trail to the end, something I hadn't done on previous hikes. It was a little out of the way, but I knew the general direction of the end. I wasn't worried about getting lost. As I kept walking, the path seemed to narrow. More rocks, roots, and overgrown brush made the way a bit trickier, but nothing I couldn't handle. I liked the challenge. There was something about it. The feeling of being out there, completely alone, surrounded by nature, calmed me, but today it didn't. The silence began to settle in deeper. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt oppressive, like something was watching me. It was probably just my mind playing tricks, but the sensation wouldn't go away. Every time I stopped to take a break, I felt the weight of the forest bearing down on me. The trees were too close now, their branches reaching out almost like fingers, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes. I figured I was being paranoid. I'd been hiking alone for years and never had a problem, but today felt off. I pushed forward, forcing myself to ignore the nagging feeling at the back of my mind. The path began to ascend slightly, taking me higher into the forest. The ground was getting rockier, and the trail was now winding through thicker trees, creating an almost tunnel-like effect as the path seemed to close in. I stopped for a quick breath, looking around. The trees here were older, their bark rough and twisted, their roots exposed like veins creeping out of the earth. I hadn't noticed before, but there was an odd sound in the air, an almost rhythmic thud, as if something large was moving through the woods, just out of sight. It stopped as quickly as it started. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but still that uneasy feeling crept back. I decided to keep going, knowing that I could either be paranoid or take the risk of cutting my hike short and feeling like I'd missed something. So I pushed on. The trail began to widen again, and I could see the trees start to break up ahead. It felt like I was nearing some sort of clearing. The sunlight broke through the clouds just a little, casting a faint glow on the ground, and the air seemed to open up. There was something welcoming about it, but at the same time, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I stopped. Something was off. The ground wasn't as soft here, it was harder, almost like stone. I took a step forward and paused. There were marks in the dirt, fresh and deep, like something had dragged through it. The patterns weren't random, there was a methodical nature to them. My heart rate quickened, but I pushed the thought aside. It wasn't unusual for animals to leave tracks, probably just some wildlife. But then I saw it. In the middle of the clearing, lying half hidden under a pile of leaves, was a large, rusted metal object. It looked out of place. It was half buried, but the edges were jagged and sharp. A piece of old machinery, maybe? A forgotten relic? I couldn't make out much of its shape yet, but the sight of it sent a chill through me. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up again. I stepped closer, my curiosity overpowering any sense of caution. The closer I got, the more I realized that it wasn't just any piece of discarded junk. There were signs of something on it, something I couldn't quite place at first, but it felt wrong. There were markings, but not from any animals I could recognize. Not scratches or gnaw marks, more like deliberate cuts, harsh lines, too precise for a natural cause. I knelt down, inspecting it closer. My hand hovered above the dirt, hesitant, but I couldn't stop myself. The desire to know was stronger than the feeling of dread. As my fingers brushed the edge of the object, I recoiled. It was cold, even though the air around me was growing warmer. I looked closer, and that's when I saw it. A handprint, a large, smeared handprint, right on the side of the rusted metal. My stomach twisted. The print was too big to be mine, and it was fresh. The dirt around it wasn't disturbed. It wasn't an animal's print either. No, this was something else. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I slowly backed away, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the object. The handprint burned into my mind. I turned in a slow circle, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with every movement in the woods. The air felt thick, heavy. The sound of rustling behind me stopped me in my tracks. I whipped around, heart pounding. Nothing, just trees. My breath came out in shallow gasps. I had to keep going. I turned back toward the path, but the moment my feet hit the dirt, I heard something. A snap, like a twig breaking, followed by the soft, quick padding of footsteps on the ground. I wasn't alone. I knew it. My breath hitched in my chest, and I began to walk faster. Then it was running. The footsteps behind me were too close now, too fast. I pushed my legs harder, moving through the brush, weaving through the trees, the crunching of dry leaves and branches snapping beneath my feet. The sound of footsteps was gaining, getting louder. Whoever or whatever was following me was close. So close. I could feel the adrenaline surge through my body, my mind screaming for me to get away, to make it to the trailhead where I could finally find safety. But the path was twisting, turning, and the more I ran, the further the trail seemed to stretch out before me. I wasn't sure where the trail ended anymore. I wasn't sure I even knew where I was. I risked a glance behind me. No one was there. I was alone again, but the feeling of being watched, being hunted, didn't go away. It stayed with me, settled deep into my bones, growing stronger with every step. Finally, after what felt like hours of running through the woods, I broke through the trees into the clearing where the trailhead should have been. My legs were burning, and I was gasping for air, but the sight of the open space filled me with a sense of relief. I was out. I was safe. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, my hands on my knees. The trees seemed to be closing in behind me, and the air was thick with that same oppressive silence. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but the forest seemed wrong, not as welcoming as it had been earlier. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the distance at the edge of the trees. Not far, but just enough to make me freeze. It was someone, a person, watching me from the shadows, but I couldn't make out their face. I couldn't see their eyes. The figure stood still, unmoving, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't wait. I turned and ran as fast as I could, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring the way my heart felt like it might burst from my chest. This time, I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I made it to the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. The driver didn't ask questions, but I could tell they saw the fear in my eyes. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't gone back to those woods since. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But I know what I felt, and I know what I saw. I'm just glad I made it out alive. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys being alone, the type who loves the silence of nature, the kind of silence where you can hear the leaves rustling and the wind brushing through the trees. That's what I was after when I decided to go camping by myself in the middle of nowhere, far from any crowded campsites or noisy roads. It was supposed to be just me, my tent, and the wilderness, a break from everything. But as I look back now, I wonder why I thought this was a good idea. It started simple enough. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, knife, and a few other essentials. I didn't need much. The trip was meant to be 2 days, maybe 3, depending on how I felt. I drove out on a Friday afternoon. The weather was nice. The sun was still high, and everything seemed perfect. I wasn't worried. I knew the area was remote, but thought it would be fine. I had done this before, although not in such an isolated spot. I knew my way around the basics, knew what to do in case of an emergency. I parked my car at the edge of the woods, where the trail started, and began my hike. The trail was narrow and barely marked, but I had a map. It was old and a little torn up, but I had studied it before coming. After about an hour of walking, I reached the area where I planned to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. There was a stream running nearby, the sound of water a pleasant background to the otherwise quiet woods. I knew I was far from any real roads. The place felt peaceful, untouched. I took a deep breath, took in the fresh air, and felt a sense of relief. Setting up camp was easy. I picked a spot near the stream, got my tent up, arranged my things inside, and even built a small fire pit. The sun started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. There was something comforting about the fading daylight and the crackling of the fire. I started to cook dinner. It was nothing special, just a can of beans and some dried fruit, but it tasted like the best meal in the world. I sat by the fire, eating and listening to the sounds of nature around me. Every so often, an animal would rustle in the bushes, but it was nothing alarming. A deer, a rabbit, nothing that would cause concern. As darkness fully settled in, I decided to go for a short walk. The fire was enough to light the campsite, but the woods were pitch black beyond the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the shadows, feeling the cool evening air brush against my face. It was eerily quiet out there. Not a single sound other than my footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. I walked along the edge of the clearing, trying to ignore the slight unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't anything specific, just that feeling, you know? The one where you're aware of the stillness, the emptiness around you. It was too quiet. After a few minutes, I stopped. Something caught my attention, a shape in the distance. It wasn't an animal. It was too big, too still. I shined the flashlight over to where I thought I saw something. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and underbrush. I took another step forward. No more shadows. The shape had disappeared. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself I was just imagining things. It was probably just a pile of rocks or an odd-shaped tree trunk. I turned back toward the campsite, walking faster now, trying to shake the sudden chill that had settled in my chest. When I got back to my tent, I locked the zipper closed and crawled inside, trying to push the strange feeling out of my mind. I tried to distract myself, reading a book by flashlight, but it was hard to focus. My thoughts kept wandering back to the shape I thought I saw. I kept telling myself it wasn't anything. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the occasional creak of branches in the wind. I didn't hear any animals. No owls, no coyotes, not even the sound of a squirrel scurrying up a tree. The woods felt unnaturally quiet. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, and the thought of something unknown, lurking just outside my tent made my skin crawl. Eventually, I drifted off, but it wasn't restful sleep. The night passed in restless dreams, flickering images of dark shapes moving through the woods, of whispers in the wind, of the feeling that I wasn't alone. Morning came, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't the bright, cheery kind of morning I'd hoped for. Instead, it was overcast, and the air was thick, humid, and heavy. I didn't know it at the time, but the weather was about to turn. I packed up my things, took down the tent, and decided to take a short hike around the area, hoping to find something to calm my nerves. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The trail, the one I had come down the previous day, didn't look quite right. The trees seemed different, the path seemed shorter, but I chalked it up to being half asleep and confused from the restless night. As I kept walking, the sky grew darker, the clouds pressing in closer. There was a storm coming. I knew that much from the wind picking up and the sudden drop in temperature. I decided to head back to my camp to take shelter. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every turn felt wrong, every step heavier than the last. The woods around me felt oppressive. I didn't know if it was the storm, the lack of sleep, or something else entirely, but the woods were starting to feel wrong. I finally reached my campsite, but something was off. The fire pit, the tent, everything was in place, but it didn't feel like my camp anymore. The air was thick with tension, and the unease I'd felt the previous night was back, stronger than before. That's when I saw it. There were footprints near the fire pit, fresh ones, and they weren't mine. I don't know how I missed them when I left for my walk earlier, but now they were unmistakable. Large, heavy prints in the soft earth, leading off toward the trees. I froze, staring at them for a long time, my heart hammering in my chest. The prints weren't animal tracks. They were too big, too deep, and they were too close to my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and started scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the clearing, watching me. But there was nothing, just trees, just shadows. I packed up the rest of my things quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but no one did. I made my way to the car as fast as I could, my hands shaking as I loaded everything into the trunk. I kept looking around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, but the forest was still, too still. As I pulled out of the woods and back onto the main road, I couldn't help but feel relieved. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I didn't think it was anything malicious, but there was something about that place, something about the way it felt, that was too unsettling to ignore. I don't know if someone else had been in those woods or if it was something else entirely, but I knew for certain I wasn't going to go back. It wasn't the typical ghost story kind of experience. There were no flickering lights or things jumping out at me, no strange sounds at night, but there was a presence, something I couldn't quite explain, something that had watched me from the trees. The fact that it was real, the fact that it was someone else or something else, made it all the more unsettling. I don't go camping anymore, not in those kinds of places, and I'm not sure I ever will. But sometimes when I'm out walking, I'll see a tree line off in the distance, and for just a moment, I'll feel it again, the same uneasy feeling I had that night. That's when I know I made the right choice to leave. I'll never know what it was, but I do know one thing. Nature isn't always as peaceful as it seems.